Good morning, everyone, and welcome to IGTV. On the screen right now, we've got Mark Capers, and Mark is going to be talking to us about incident response and planning and pointers. All right, Mark, take it away.
Good morning, Joe. Today on incident response practical infosec, I'll talk about incident response planning and preparedness. Just a little bit of background on me. I had spent 7 years on the EDS, Global Computer Incident Response Team, setting our clients up with our incident response services and doing incident response and forensic practices there. What I want to do today is talk about some pretty high-level pointers on setting up incident response planning. A lot of companies, they have good security departments, but they don't always have a documented formal incident response plan. It's really kind of critical to do. Why do you want to plan for incidents? If you have a plan and you execute a plan, you will reduce your mean time, both in terms of outages and recovery. By sticking through a process, you know what you're going to react to as if you plan those scenarios ahead of time. Having a plan will also help you ensure an appropriate reaction. It'll ensure the appropriate response and remediation for what you're dealing with. If you have to pursue criminal or civil proceedings, having a formal response plan is critical. You know, defense counsel will try to take you apart any way they can, even if you don't do your own forensics, even if you have to outsource that to a forensic consultant. Having a plan to say when you turn it over to that consultant is critical. Likewise, if you happen to be served by either another company or by law enforcement, having a plan on how to deal with that aids you immeasurably and can turn what would normally be a really bad day into something that you're capable of coping with without too much fuss. What do you need to plan for incident response? You need your management and your leadership support, which is pretty easy sell if you've got a good risk process in your organization. And even if you don't, if you start walking through the scenarios of what your potential losses are and how much that costs the company in both terms of direct loss and recovery man time hours, you can usually get pretty good buy-in from your leadership. What are the triggers and sources that are going to kick off your incident response plan? What security systems do you have that generate automated alerts? How does that feed into your incident response? What sorts of human elements and non-automated systems might trigger incident response? Do you take phone calls from help desks? Do you get engaged from your legal counsel or your HR group? What services does your incident response provide other organizations within your company or organization? What are your incident severities? How do you go about triaging, and how do you plan your responses? You need to understand how you're going to categorize various incidents, how you're going to quarantine, and how you're going to react. Try to also come up with remediation and recovery strategies. How will you recover from an incident? Who manages a recovery and who validates the remediation and recovery? If you're restoring a business system, who signs off that the business system is back to business as usual? You're going to need a contact list, and you're going to need to build a good contact list of your major stakeholders, your support personnel, what they are responsible for, and how to engage them and how to contact them. And if you're a modern organization, you're going to need to know how to do that on a 7x24 basis. You're going to have to come up with an escalation plan. Do you expect your incident life cycle to look like? What are the engagement, reporting, and communications requirements that you have? And then what are your other organizational processes? You know, do you need to tie that to your IT operations processes, to your disaster recovery business continuity? What are your enterprise risk processes? So those are all things you need to think about. Incident severity, triage, and response. Talking about severity scheme level for a minute, you want to come up with a series of severities along these security incidents that tie them both kind of to your operational security severities as well as tie them to your enterprise risk. IDLE is a great IT standard. It focuses its incident severities on operational and service levels. Security incidents we found are a little bit different. And I always like to categorize a security event or a security incident separately from an operations incident because you've got privacy, you've got breaches, there are different things to consider. So you may want to break that out a little bit differently if you already have, an operational incident. Document escalation rules. Who will you need to be engaged for what severity? When do you get your CIO involved? When do you get your CEO involved? How do you get your public relations people involved? If it's a very public defacement, you're going to want to get ahead of that early. You're going to want to be feeding your public relations department to say, okay, we need to stay ahead of this and talk about how we're going to recover and what steps we're taking. And you don't want to do that as the IT person. You want your PR person to do that. Likewise with legal, you don't want to try to figure out the laws. You want to engage your legal counsel early and say, how do you want us to posture our response? And what should we do in terms of recovery versus evidence preservation? If it's something that you get hacked badly and you need to bring in law enforcement, you want to know how to do that, and you're going to do that through your legal counsel. Document your decision process for your artifact and collection. I just touched on this a little bit, but this is really critical. Early on in the incident, decide how you're going to respond, because if you're doing a forensic investigation, that's very different than saying, okay, our public web server got defaced. We just want to restore it and get back to business as usual. We don't care. There was not too much damage to the company, and it was only for a couple hours at 3 a.m., so we caught it. Versus if it's a really bad PR mess and you've got someone like WikiLeaks or Anonymous out there crowing about it, do you decide, hey, we want to go after these guys? If it's private data or company information, intellectual property, somebody steals credit numbers, you're going to need to get the FBI involved or local law enforcement, and that's going to take life on its own. So you have to handle that evidence collection very differently. And in fact, they'll have to come and do it in some cases. Incident planning, you need to document your resources. You got to find out what are your critical applications. You got to understand what your critical applications, your critical business systems are. Understand your critical networks. Where is your critical data? Have you met with your business stakeholders to find out what their critical business data is, where it is, how it's kept, and what value it is? Your perception of what's valuable to hackers may be different than somebody in your finance department, and it's a good idea to go out there and just talk with them about, all right, what would happen if this either got destroyed or compromised? And that will give you a better idea of how you need to respond in those such situations. Also understand your actual physical facilities. Who runs your buildings? Who runs your power? And make sure that you know how to get a hold of them and can engage them during your incident. Likewise with vendors. If you have a long-distance carrier or WAN carrier or something, it's very important to know how to work with them during a crisis. The question of hands-on or hands-off incident response. I typically am a pretty big fan of hands-off incident response. And what that means is when you're performing an incident investigation, work into the process how your systems will be accessed by whom. When you're trying to recover artifacts, when you're trying to determine what exactly has happened, who do you want doing that work? If you actually engage your systems administrators, you have a much better idea of what's going to work in the system, what's not going to work. They should be knowing those systems a lot better than you do in a lot of cases. And it provides you a second set of eyes and ears to say, well, we had to load this patch because of this business application. That's why that's there. And it provides you a document and a witness while you're doing this investigation. Again, once you get into forensics, it's a little bit different. When you're doing a forensic image copy, you definitely need two people. And more than likely, that's either going to be, your forensic practitioners, whether it's in-house or outside a house, and they're going to need to be monitored and witnessed. Talking about the trigger sources, when you're planning your incident response, what do you expect to trigger your incident response? You've got a bunch of automated tools out there now that do a great job of telling you when they see something is wrong. Intrusion detection systems, virus software, SEM systems, log management systems, firewall and router logs. There's a lot of people who write standard scripts for firewalls and routers saying, this looks anomalous, they kick off an alarm. And, you can, people use tripwire, you can do your own thing. How do you aggregate those? How do you correlate them? And does it just dump into a mailbox and you're trying to drink out of the fire hose? Or, think about how you want to come up with rationally coping with that. In non-automated systems and human sources, do you take calls from end users? Is it routed through a help desk? Can they report security incidents? Systems and network administrators I found to be a great resource for incidents, especially with advanced persistent threats. They can, having them be able to call the incident response team and say, you know what, my system's operating really weird. We've looked at a bunch of things, but it might be a security incident. Can you take a look at it? It's very important. Likewise with your internal leadership, human resources, legal, etc., as well as other organizations. You're going to have vendors come in that you work with all the time, and maybe they have a security incident and somehow it affects you. Likewise with clients. If they have a really bad breach and it didn't originate with you, but it may reach into you, you want to know how to interact with those corresponding security personnel. Likewise with law enforcement and other civil action. Somebody may show up at your door with a subpoena or a court order. You're going to want to have a plan to cope with that. For your human sources, this is pretty important in the incident response process, especially with your user community and your system admin community. How do you validate that the user is authorized to report the incident? How do you go back and check, is this person who he says he is? You don't want to get phished by, within your own incident security process. So it's important to have, contact lists and corporate directory. And if the guy says, hey, I'm Joe Smith from accounting, pull up Joe Smith from accounting's office number and say, okay, I'll call you back in 5 minutes. And just have a process to either go back to him or go back to his manager and verify that he is authorized to make that kind of incident report. Again, with system admin calls, it's also important to understand that, operational problems look like security problems sometimes, and vice versa. Security problems look like operational problems. And you want to foster that cooperative feeling so that your system admins feel free to call and you get engaged and say, all right, maybe it was just a bug in a patch and you recovered from it, no harm, no foul. And it helps you actually demonstrate your incident response process pretty well, even for those false positives. The contact list and communications plan, you want to maintain a contact list. If you have a corporate directory, great, but you want to make sure you identify the key players for your plan. Leverage your business continuity and disaster recovery plans if you have them already. Make sure your key leadership roles know what your incident response plan is and are ready to be engaged should that happen. And that includes your CEO, legal, public relations, and human resources at minimum. Understand who your key system support contacts are. Your system admins, your DBAs, webmasters, your network support, anything that supports your infrastructure, you want to know how to get a hold of them at any time. Your key vendors and your outsourcers and your third-party providers, make sure, likewise, you can't just call the sales guy at 3 a.m., for this slick new web service you've got. You're going to know how to get a hold of the guys who are running the operation. The escalation plan ties back into your communication plan, and that's critical. And that tells you how do you contact all of these key contacts, when do you contact them, at what severity, and at what frequency. Often, if it's a bad incident, you're going to be reporting to the CIO half an hour, 15 minutes, whatever's appropriate. And part of the triage you can actually establish that based on the incident. But typically with your severity levels, you want to kind of tie that together so you know ahead of time roughly what you're doing. What is a typical incident life cycle? And again, each of these stages will have a communications escalation cycle back. You have an initial incident report and validation. You have an initial triage. You do an impact assessment. You provide an incident initial rating, and you start planning the specific response for that incident based on kind of some canned scenarios. You then kick off your incident investigation and assessment. You've got artifact collection, forensic collection. You can do quarantine, remediation, recovery. You move then into artifact analysis. You get the remediation and validation, and then the reporting. After you've documented your incident response process, make sure you evangelize it with your community. And this is the big thing too. ensuring that groups and individuals and leadership in your organization knows what your plan is, knows what your response process is, and it's critical. So get them on board, make sure they know how to engage you, and make sure they know you're going to engage them. And I'll include on the chat in a couple seconds some more white papers, both from the Carnegie Mellon CERT group as well as SANS.org, that'll help get you started. And that's incident response in a nutshell.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.
I appreciate it. That was, it goes quick, believe it or not.
Yes.